Welcome to the Spool Podcast. Unwind with Dr. Nils Roemer, Dean of the Bass School at UT Dallas.
There was a lot of changes in the 1800s too that mattered. Some inventions, that obviously got better and better. But things were happening then, and cities become, major metropolitans came up in the 1800s.
Right.
And I wonder, how were they built then? How did they build those big cities?
Well, that's interesting, how the whole experience of city becomes something that is, so stunning to contemporaries at the time that they are quite bewildered by it. So if you go back, in the 1780s, no major big cities outside of Paris and a few others really exist. By the 1880s, the experience of living in big cities becomes more and more a common experience. But it's so bewildering and so novel that there's a very quick realization that urban life is different from rural life. And there's, both in Europe as well as in the States, you mentioned Chicago, this newly emerging field called urban sociology, because there's an attempt to understand what not just is urban life, just lots of people in one small place with a lot of noise, a lot of smoke, or is it something else? Does it change how we as individuals act or sleep or do? And there's a whole line of study that very quickly establishes the challenges to our core identities as individuals that experience themselves different if you live in environments where you wake up in the morning and everyone along the way, you've known them, because it's your village, very social, stable social environments, from being on a train where you don't interact with a single soul, even the ones that is closest to you.
Right.
And you're rubbing, your shoulders next to them. And so there's a sense really that urban life in Europe is quickly seen around 1900 as challenging, as possibly disastrous to mental health, to communities, to tradition. Whereas I think on the other side in the United States, very quickly becomes this recognition of that as well, but also the realization that city is liberating.
Right.
That's coming to a city, it opens up possibilities. And so therefore, very different form of thinking about urban life, but very clearly novel, different, challenging, also from a perspective of keeping it sustainable, thinking about tenement houses, thinking about lighting, thinking about water supply and all those things are big challenges. But we are the inheritors of that time. And if you go to any big cities these days and have your time off, New York, Central Park, you just always think, you guys were so smart when you did this. We're so lucky that the last 20, 30 years, that was not to us to make that decision, because we probably would have built it all up.
Right.
But we have these big parks in New York or in Berlin or wherever you go,
Yeah. What's always been interesting to me is, first of all, big cities all seem to be on a waterway.
That's right.
So that was always very important. But let's go back. How did they travel, communicate? Before there were roads, when they were in a horse-drawn carriage, how did they go to a town and create it? How did they pick the spots? And then how did they draw those maps back then? How did they make those lines of, demarcation? I'm New Mexico, you're Arizona. How did they do that?
Well, Mexico, Arizona would have been like a, fairly wide range of territory to overcome. But I think, there we do make sometimes a mistake that we think, again, that only we are now global citizens, that only we have an awareness of things going on elsewhere.
Right.
And when you go, let's say, back to medieval towns, you start to understand that there were already dots on interconnected trade routes that stretched over wide territories.
But how did they do that? How did they know somebody was going to be 5 miles
Well,
from
they've
them?
done it, more than once, and they kind of came back and forth, and therefore along the rivers, like in Europe,
Right.
you would have these trade routes that then kind of connected them with the Mediterranean, and from there onwards. And so you have, therefore, we talk about change, we talk about technology, earlier music, big change that is propelling, actually probably almost quasi-revolutions of sorts, come the arrival of coffee.
Right.
Because coffee create coffeehouses. Coffeehouses create a social environment where like-minded people out together
Right.
for no reason other than to be themselves and come up with good ideas or bad ideas.
Right.
But there's a strong sense that if it wouldn't have been for the pubs in England and Scotland in particular, and for the coffee houses in Europe, the Enlightenment probably would not have happened.
Right. Right.
So that's like,
Interesting.
but it's coffee that, or chocolate is another one
Right.
of these novelties that arrives in the early modern times in Europe.
That's amazing. When you think of it, let's talk about what technology came because of World War I.
Oh, okay. Are you fishing for a particular one? Chemical warfare is the big one, and it's one that the Germans are credited for. But that invention of nerve gas, I think that's what you're referring to, Germans are really embracing this at a moment when they're into the war well over a year.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of initial enthusiasm and the expectation of quick, decisive victories have all but fallen away. And the First World War has just become their very nightmare that it, ultimately would become in the memories of the generation to come. And the Germans think that by unleashing now chemical weapons, that is the one way for them to balance out the scale again, and hopefully to accelerate to a quicker and definitive ending in a victory.
So basically, you think World War I, it was a lot of military was the technology that was
Yeah.
being used, for the military. Was there anything that the society was able to use after the war
Well,
because
an
of it?
interesting one, that's also credited, to have been related to the First World War is propaganda. Propaganda was all about supporting the kind of nascent film industry.
Mhm.
And again, the Germans poured in a lot of financial resources into their kind of beginning of the film industry, which at least in the opening years of the 1920s still meant that the German film industry, the Weimar Republic, was one of the supreme film producers. I mean, obviously Hollywood overtook them at some point
Right,
shortly
right.
thereafter, but a lot of this is still tied to the influx of money and resources that were given to the filmmakers during the First World War. So clearly, that's one of the other outcomes from the German perspective of the First World War.
World War II now, I think there might have been more technology that came out of World War II that was used in society beyond it, but I could be wrong. You're giving me too much credit about the chemical warfare.
Okay.
I was asking you because I didn't know.
All right,
You
all
know,
right. You were looking for something. I
Yeah.
thought,
So World War II, what technology did you see from World War II happening?
Well, obviously, there are, I'm not a military historian, but the big thing that really, again, becomes a marker of the 20th century, which begins actually a little earlier, is the radio, telegraph. But I think the radio becomes a key element also of the Second World War in terms of being something that means that the World War is not just carried out on a global scale, but really also something that people around the world
Right.
are following on a day-to-day basis as it unfolds. So I think, radios are now produced at a rapid pace so that they can be at home. So that's one. On the perspective of military technology is advancing rapidly, not just in terms of submarines, but also of smaller, faster tanks. But then mostly the biggest change is really aerial warfare.
Right.
I mean, they're really clunky going into, most air forces are fairly traditional going into the Second World War. That's why the Germans dominate early on. But then obviously the British and the Americans are catching up, and therefore war becomes increasingly also dominated by aerial warfare, a big innovation of that time, which to this day, the bombardment of civilians is part and parcel of how, what in our minds nowadays, when we think about war is not so much any longer about a boat landing and the Vikings getting off and then attacking, right? So combat by man or horse or something like that. But I think in our common imagination, when we think about war, it's about aerial warfare. It's about rocket launches created during the Second World War and aerial warfare, just well before tanks or kind of, soldiers land anywhere.
When it comes to humanities, how do you explain it to students?
what humanities are about and, why they're relevant. I think, for starters, I think the simple realization that, as students, they are also the children of. And so they have all this, I think we all have an innate sense that we are not the first ones, but in other words, we've come from somewhere. And I think as you grow up, you have increasingly also a sense that who you become is also shaped by your family, the traditions, and all of those, the culture, maybe even the languages and so on and so forth. And I think that's equally true for our society, that we are shaped very much around the things that predates us, that have come before. You talked earlier about how a whole generation experienced at the same time the assassination of JFK.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you can break out generations and kind of delineate the foundational experiences that they had and that shaped them. That's why we are talking about these generations of the silent, the baby boomers, and so on and so forth, because they don't just simply have a decade in common. They have common experiences that they shared and that shaped them. And I think understanding that our generation has had these different markers, so to speak. For me, it's maybe like the Cure or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Then let's say for others, and understanding that therefore, when we try to address some of our biggest issues in our societies, we come to this with these different markers and memories. And we have to kind of be aware of that if we want to together move forward. That's what the humanities are about.
So let me ask you this, though, too, because I feel like there's a lot of philosophy attached to humanities. But that opens up the door to a lot of different opinions. Who's right, who's not right? It's like, how does all that work out that everybody could have a different opinion on a certain thing and it still works?
Well, what we would say is that what we do is evidence-based arguments. In other words, yes, there can be different of opinions, but part of the challenge is you have to make your case on the basis of something.
Right.
You can't just randomly argue for something. There has to be some body of evidence that you're drawing on. And it also allows you to kind of test why, for example, this body of evidence is relevant or not. And I think that's, for example, something that in our society we are now challenging. I mean, this idea that in all parts of culture and the arts, we're starting to understand that maybe our idea of tradition is a little narrow. Maybe there's not just a whole bunch of white guys of old age that produces. Maybe when it comes to world literature, it could be more inclusive. Maybe when it comes to classical music, it can be wider. Maybe when it comes to visual traditions, it doesn't all have the high point in Paris and Berlin of the 1920s, but it happens in different ways around the globe. And I think that is a really interesting conversation because it's not just one about the past, but also very much about our future, who we want to be, what we teach, and what we come to understand to be our tradition. If you run an art museum, like let's say our local one, the DMA, the DMA is created as what we call a universal art museum. So it's not about French art, or it's not about American art. It's ideally about all of them. But what is all of them actually? And how do you arrange all of them? Do you arrange them in a chronology? Is there something like modern African art, or does African art only, like historically did, have a place in kind of the pre-modern world? So those are really big questions. Just how do we arrange knowledge, and how do we make people appreciate it? And what kind of stories again do we tell?
Right.
Do we tell like a story of creativity, or do we tell a story of kind of almost a genealogy of greatness that culminates in a certain moment in time? Paris or New York or Barcelona or whatever you want to choose, or do we want to create a story that actually speaks to many of us, and hopefully will continue to speak also to many of us going forward, not just to you and me.
Right.
Different challenge,